might want to verify that indeed I'm streaming. Okay. All right, let's get started. Right, so today's topic I'd like to talk about is an overview or review of a CSS. Again, most of this you might be already familiar with. I just want to make sure we have a common baseline understanding of CSS. So basically, what as I was showing you here on the chalkboard is CSS allows you to extract any styling information from the page and declare it elsewhere, right? Declare it in a separate file so that you can refer to various portions and elements in the original document and say what styles you want to format it with, right? The syntax of you being able to refer to those other elements is that you have what is called a selector, right? And then you have various properties and values that you can configure, right? You can configure the font, the color, the background color, the various things, right? And the way you say is that you say, I want to change this particular property, and this is the value that I want to set it, right? Putting it with a colon in between, and then semicolon, and then another property, and then the value, and so on and so forth, right? So selector is what allows you to refer to various portions of the document, right? I want to select all the H1s, all the paragraphs, all the unordered lists, right? And I want to change these properties to these values. Make sense? Here's an example of what it might look like. You might say you can declare at the style level in the head tag. There's a dedicated style element that allows you to, again, select a portion of the document and select what the properties might be. So let's create here a page to get started. Excuse me, I'm sick today. On HTML documents, let's get started. Intro.html. In here, we don't need output. And view, there's a, what's the, to view things in full screen? Do you remember? I forget what the shortcut is. I don't see it. Was it in tools? I forget what it was. Anyway, okay, so let's see. Let's add some content here. Let's put a title. So this is CSS review, and let's do an H1 here that says I want to do a CSS review. So we might get started and say that I want to change the style of this H1, and the way I could do it is right here and there, right? I can say style equals, and I want the color for this text to be red, right? Right, and if I run this, notice that it shows red, right? Like we would expect. Notice that if I don't have the style, right, it's just black. So who's to say that it's black? And who chose this font? So these are the default styling that the browser chose for me, right? Each browser has a default styling that all documents inherit from, such as Times New Roman is the default font. Also, it's not shown here, but there's an 8-pixel margin all around the body. Again, that it's inherited from the default style from the browser. You can look at the default styling by looking at inspect elements on Chrome, and you get an explorer here that allows you a console that allows you to look at the various properties of your documents, right? You have several tabs here. One of them is the Elements tab. The Elements tab gives you the interpretation, how the browser has interpreted your document. Right? You can look at the original document. Here's the original document, right? The raw HTML that was downloaded from the server. Yes, and indeed that is the raw HTML. But if you go to the elements, it's how the browser is interpreting your document, right? So for instance, you have a head, you have the title and whatnot, you have the H1. So this is an object representation, right? A hierarchical object representation of how the browser has parsed your HTML. Notice that if I miss, right, if I have bad HTML, right, like this, and I don't close a tag, if I refresh, the source. Oh, did I refresh? Okay, notice that it's not closed, right? But the elements, if I parse, notice that it did close it, right? So this is the way the browser is interpreting, right? The object representation internally, it's object model of what it parsed. Okay. All right. So let me fix that. I refresh. There it is. So this is very useful to this tool is very useful. Most browsers have a very useful console, right? That allows you to navigate through various aspects of it. One of the things that it allows you to see is any stylings that are applied to the current element that you're selecting. Like for instance, I can select the body, or I can select the H1. Notice at the bottom it shows the styles that are currently applied to this H1. These are the ones that are applied directly on the H1 tag. Notice that it's empty. There's nothing applied to the actual tag. But notice over here in gray are the ones that are inherited from the it says from the user agent. That's the browser. Right? These are the styles that are inherited from the user agent. So for instance, it says that it's a block, right? It's displayed as a block. It has a particular set of margins, right? It has the font that it's bolded, right? So all those things are inherited. How about the body? If I click on the body, notice that it's again it's block, right? But it also has a margin of 8 pixels. You see that? Right. So that's without me doing anything, right? I didn't ask for this margin, right? It's what it's inherited. All right. This tool is also very, very useful for me to, for designers to do live coding, right? And look at what things might look live, right? And once they're happy with it, they might copy the stylings from this tool and then make it permanent on their CSS file, right? So for instance, it says, oh, I wonder what this might look like with color red. Right? Notice that it changes live, right, on the browser, right? It's changing the object model, right? Notice that it's changing the way the object model is being interpreted. There it is, body. It's as if I would have said style color red. If I'm happy with it, I can just copy this and I can go to my file and say, yes, that's exactly what I want, the style color red. Now I've made it permanent, right? Here I'm not editing the original file, right? I'm only editing the object representation in the browser. So now I can refresh, and now the changes have been made permanent because I changed the original file. Notice that as I hover over the elements, it highlights the left-hand side, right? It shows me in blue the actual block content. And in salmon, like in this beige salmon color, it shows like the margins, right? The margins are padding around this. Notice that it shows on the right-hand side a box representation of this content of the current element that I'm selecting. Right. So for instance, here I'm selecting the head, title, the body. Here's the H1. So for H1, notice that it shows here a box model. This is what it's called, the box model. And meaning every element that is rendered, right? Every element that is rendered on the browser, it has a box model associated with it, right? It has a margin associated with it. Notice that it highlights on the left-hand side. Means the margins that it's a space between me, right, and other things, right? The borders is any border a dotted border or slash border or maybe a solid border, right? That might be around this. There is no border, right? Padding is any space between the content and the border. And then finally, the actual content, right? And the content has a width and height. Does that make sense? Right? And you can change each one of these, right? So the padding, I can change the padding right here. Right, I added, well, that's too big, 23. So notice that I'm adding a padding, right? Notice that this is highlighted in the margins. The padding, I selected 23, only the top one. All of these typically have also margins all around, or margins top, margin bottom, margin right, margin left, right? Each one of these, yes. These are pixels by default. By default, on the right-hand side, yeah, on the right. No, but as I am editing this, right, these are all pixels as I'm editing over here. But the ones that are inherited by the browser, the browser has set them as EMs, right? Ems are a scalable value that is a fraction of the size of your font, right? So 1 EM, for instance, represents the default font of 12 points, right? So the default size of the font is 12 points. 1 EM represents 12 points. Okay, so 2 EM is twice as many points. Okay, yeah, points. All right, that makes sense. The box model, right? So when somebody asks, "Oh, the box model," oh, that's what it is, right? The grouping of these values, the margins, the border, the padding, and the actual width and height of the actual content. Make sense? The size, when you talk about the size of the content, typically we mean this, right? The inner width and height, the inner size of the content, right? The actual size of the entire thing really is the inner width and height, right? Plus any padding, any border, any margins, right? That's the entire width, right? And the entire height. Usually we refer to that as the outer width and the outer height. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little later. jQuery, in JavaScript allow you to change every single thing, right? All these things. So we'll play around with it a little later. Anyway, so here I did it. I was changing the style inline right here on the H1, and this is a very bad practice. Okay, so I should expect never to see this in any of your code, right? That you have a style attribute right on the tag, right? Or you should have a very compelling reason why you would use this format, right? Of styling right on the element. Okay, if you're playing around and experimenting, okay, that makes sense, right? But any code that you actually publish or you push to a source control should not have this, right? Instead, a little better would be to use the style tag up here, right? Where you can say, hey, that H1 down there, that H1 down there, I want to change it to color red, right? Use a color, and that's red. There it is, right? So this has exactly the same effect. If I refresh, notice that it's still red, right? No changes there. This is a little better, right? This is saying all H1s, right? All H1s in this document are going to be red, okay? As opposed to changing one particular H1 to be red, right? If I do it here, it's very specific, right? It's very specific to this H1. If I do it at the style level, it's across all H1s in the entire document. It's a little better. I can reuse the style. Make sense? Okay. That means that if I have another H1, CSS, I don't know, quiz after the review, notice that they're all red, right? Everyone is being styled. But I can override. I can say the style for this is blue, color blue, right? So notice what happens is that the closer you are, right? The closer you are to the actual element, the more priority you take, right? Right. So if you're so, for instance, what happens is that this, right, is overriding the style above. Make sense? Right? So if I have here another one where it has no style, quiz results. Notice that it's red, right? Because I didn't say anything. It's whatever the style tag is saying. Everybody okay? All right. Another way that you can so I was saying this is called a selector. You know, the way you select elements. You can select either by the type of the element, right, or the name of the element. In this case, H1, or you can select by the ID, right? So I might call this, and I might call this to be the ID. I might call this the main title, right? Main title, and say that I only want to apply it to the main title, right? To target the ID, we use what is called a hash, right? The hash, it says I'm referring to an ID, okay? So that means that it's being targeted to this one H1. Notice that IDs usually are unique, right? They have to be unique. So it's being targeted. So now that when I refresh, notice that the third one says, oh, you're not targeting me because I don't have that ID, right? It's definitely not me. Not me. It's only the first one that has that particular ID. That makes sense? Okay. So yeah, so I can target by ID, or if I want to be able to reuse this style over several places. So for instance, I might say, if I want to reuse it, I might instead use what it's called a class, right? And say that I'm targeting the titles, right? The titles or headers, right? Headers. Right, and these are all headers, right? These are all headers. There's another header. There's another header. Oh, actually, header, right? Not plural. Header. And then I could say, well, all headers, right? I can say dot header. Header. Going to all be red. There it is. So now they're all red again, except the second one because I am overriding it at the style attribute at the actual element. Yes, right. So there's three ways of selecting, right? You can select either by the name of the element, the ID, or the attribute, right? You can also refer to. Actually, no. I'll cover that later. Everybody okay? All right. Again, this was a little better than declaring at the style element. I'm going attribute. I'm going to remove it because we said that that's a bad thing to do. So I'm not going to do that. All right. Notice that now they're all red. So this was a little better, but the preferred way is to link this. So rip the style from embedding it inside of the HTML and putting it in a separate file altogether. Right. So I'm just going to remove this. And I'm going to put it in a separate document. Okay, a style sheet. There it is. I'm going to call it style.css. It doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as you remember what it is. Right, so I'm going to copy here the styling that I ripped from the HTML document, but now I need to link it together. I'm going to say, hey HTML page, find your style elsewhere. Right, in this other file, right? So I'm gonna let me close all these. And the way we link it is to use the link. Let's say link. We have to tell it that we're linking a style sheet, and I need to tell it where to find it. href, and there it is. It sees it that it's in the same folder, right? It's a sibling. The file is a sibling to me. Notice if I refresh, it's still the same file. Okay. Notice that in the source, notice that this used to only be the intro.html, right? Now it's saying that I also downloaded the style.css. The way this works is that first the intro.html gets downloaded, and you could see it in the network. You notice that it downloaded the intro.html first, right? It realized that this HTML file was referring to another resource, right? So it was referring to a CSS file. So it goes back to the server again, right? Requesting the CSS file, it downloads. If it refers to other things such as JavaScript or images or anything like that, it'll do a separate request for each one of these resources, and they would be all listed here, right? Notice that the time it took to download each one of these, right? So you could do a fair amount of debugging on how long this page is taking to download these things, right? The only thing that obviously it's not going to download is if you're referring to other documents, right? Other HTML documents using anchors, right? Those are not going to be downloaded. Only when you click on them will it navigate to that page and will download that other document. Make sense? All right. All right. Let's keep going. Now this style, even though it doesn't really matter what you call it, this is a fairly common name for a CSS file, style.css. Also, it's very common to create a dedicated directory for these CSS. It might be that this is not the only CSS file that you're going to be hosting. There might be several other files, right? Maybe a bootstrap CSS, right? Or other CSS files that you might be using. So typically, you create a separate CSS file directory where you put all your CSS files, right? So I'm going to follow that same structure, right? So I'm going to move the CSS in here, right? Now that I moved it, I have to go back to my intro.html and say, oh, the style is really under CSS /. That's where it is, right? Let me test, make sure that everything's okay. Yes, still works. Everyone okay? All right. All right. So let me go back to my slides, my cheat sheet. Units. Right. So we were using pixels. We already talked about EMs. Points. We borrow points from from the print media where they use 1/72. Inches represents 1 point, or percentages where you can say a width or height or something, or the size of something is a percentage of the current font. Right? So 100%, which is what we have right now, is equivalent to 12 points. Right? So when you're looking at this right now, it's at 100%, and if you can increase the increment, right? So for instance, if you go to 200%, you're looking at 24 point font. Okay. Okay. Let me keep going here. Clear body. All right. So if you remember when we were looking at the elements, we were looking at the body. Right. Notice that it's inheriting some features, some styling from the browser. Yes, and I mean it's fine, right? It's doing its best to give us some margins. It might look funny if this were flush to the window, right? So it's adding some default margins so it looks okay, right? But this styling is not necessarily standard across all browsers, right? And not only are we inheriting body, we're inheriting the fonts, we're inheriting a whole bunch of things, right? That usually we want to have control over, right? I don't want the browser to be imposing these styles, okay? So typically, one of the first things that CSS developers do is to reset, right, or to put the style, right, of your application or your website or your web page into a well-known state. Right. So, for instance, I'm going to clear any paddings, any margins, any stylings that I am inheriting from the browser. Right. I'm going to clear them out. because I want to have full control over what this is going to look like, right? So for instance, one of the things that they might do is to clear the margins that are inherited from body, from the browser, right? So one of the things that you might do is to here, right, override, right, any stylings that you're inheriting from the browser. You might say that I don't want margins. If I want any margins, I will decide what the margins are. Okay, I don't want any paddings that I might be inheriting. Right, this technique is called resetting. Right, resetting the style to a well-known state. And there's some CSS style sheets out there. Right, there's reset.css. There's quite a few of them out there. Right, that are pretty standard. That is always a good idea to include them, right, in your projects, right, so that it resets the styling to a well-known predictable state, right? Now that I did that and I refresh here, if I refresh, notice that it moved. You see that? It moved. There's no margins anymore, right? I've reset those margins, and there's many other things that I could reset, right? For instance, the headers H1 also have some margins, right? There's some margins that are being reset, that are being chosen, right? I might choose to choose the margins, to be 0, meaning I don't want to use the margins that the browser is imposing on me. I will set my own margins and my own padding if there's any, right? So I might reset that. So I might all headers, right? H1s, H2, H3, any headers, right? I might reset that to have a 0 point and no paddings, right? So if I refresh, notice that now it's removed any margins, any paddings, right? And now it's leaving me to decide what is it that I want it to look like, right? All the defaults. I'm kind of throwing away all the defaults so I can start off brand new. Make sure that if I go from one browser to the next, right, the style will look the same. Make sense? Right? All right. So this is all resetting, right? Resetting styles inherited from browser. Okay. And there's many other things that you can reset. We're not going to go through all of them, but I just want to make you aware of the technique. Okay. And you might want to experiment, create an experiment that you might want to research that, right? We talked about the box model, borders. We can change the borders. We can look at the. Let me remove this. We can look at the particular header, right? That H1, or maybe this one, the second one. Let's do the second one, right? I can change the border. I can say that the border is 10 pixels, red, blue, and solid. Okay. Notice that it changes right there and then, right? This is using the abbreviated syntax, where I can provide the size, the color, and the style right there in one single line, right? Instead, right, it's this one over here, right? It's this syntax over here, or you can use another syntax where you can explicitly say the top, the bottom, the left, the right. Which one are you talking about, right? So I can say that this only applies to the left, right? And again, this is an abbreviated form, right? Where I can say border left has, again, size, color, and style. Or you can be much more specific, and I'd say left, the color, right, will be blue, right? And then the border of the, again, left, and the size, width will be 30 pixels. And finally, that the border left style will be dashed or dotted or double or grooved or hidden, a whole bunch of them. So I'll go with dotted. Dotted, it's not showing dotted because it's too big. So let's make this a little smaller. Okay, there they are. So you can see the dots appearing, right, on the left-hand side, right? Anyway, so the rest you can play around with it yourselves. Text, there's quite a few things we can change. Let's add some more content here to make this relevant. Let's make a paragraph here, and let's add some lorem ipsum that we can add here. Lorem ipsum. Let's copy some text. Where is it? Lorem ipsum. There it is. Let's copy that. Let's paste it in here. There it is. And then the text, I can change the style. I can say that I want text align. I can say that I want it left. Left is default, so it doesn't change anything. Or I want to justify to the right-hand side, right? Or I want it to be justified, right? Justified meaning flush on either side. I can say I can do some text decoration. I can say that I want it underlined, right? Or I want it overlined. Usually this we use for the anchors, right? When we want to style anchors, typically the default is for anchors to have an underline, right? And in modern representations of anchors, typically we don't have the underlines unless you either hover over it, right? Then we would show that it's a link. Perhaps we only change the color, or we only change it, maybe set it to a default color of blue, right? And only when you hover over it, we show that it's underlined, and so we can change that using the text decoration. We can use text transformations, transforms, and we can change this to be excuse me. We can capitalize it. We can capitalize things, meaning the first word of every, the first letter of every word. We capitalize every single first letter. We can change the whole thing to be lowercase or everything uppercase, right? You can transform it right on the browser, right? Right on the browser. We can also change the white space, right? How do you want to interpret the white space? Meaning the default is that white space is, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Typically white space, those are the space, right? The tabs and new lines, all those are white spaces. And by default, these don't even though you might use white spacing for formatting the HTML, they're all interpreted as a single space, right? They only add perhaps horizontal spacing, right, between words or between content, right? But they don't add any vertical spacing, for instance, right? Only if the content does not fit, right, then it just wraps. So the default is that the white spacing just wraps, right? If there's not enough space, it just wraps around, like over here, right? Notice that it's wrapping, right? It just wraps. We can change the behavior by using the white space attribute or property, and we can say, for instance, no wrap. The default is normal, but if we change it to no wrap, notice that it doesn't wrap anymore. You see that? It doesn't wrap. And I mean, you might not use it here, like in a paragraph. That makes absolutely no sense, right? But it might totally make sense if this is maybe the heading of a table, right? A heading of a table, typically, you don't want it to wrap, right? Perhaps, but the table might not be big. The column might not be big enough, right, to fit the entire title of the table of the heading. So it wraps, right? And you might want to force it not to wrap, and this is how you would do it. Make sense? Notice what happened here. This scroll bar at the bottom. You see that, right? Typically, I would not accept a scroll bar at the bottom. Okay, I don't want to see any scroll bars at the bottom in any of your pages. any of your experiments, any of your homepage, your project, right? You have to have a very compelling reason why you're having here a scroll bar at the bottom. Okay, it really, it looks ugly, right? Only have again, if you have a very compelling reason to have a scroll bar at the bottom. Typically, you want this. In this case, if you remove the white space, this is as far as we're concerned, this is responsive, right? It nicely degrades, right, from a desktop, a large screen. It degrades nicely, maybe to a tablet, right, or to a phone, right? I can see this. I can scroll over this, right? I don't have any vertical scrolling, horizontal scrolling, right? Vertical scrolling is okay, right? I can always scroll with my finger, but horizontal scrolling is usually a bad practice. Again, unless you have a very compelling reason. Okay, keep going. Page down, fonts. What time does this end? 1:25, right? Okay, so I have almost backgrounds, box shadow. Before I go into it, I want to get into something more interesting. Let's go into floats. Let's go into floats. As we've said earlier, we've talked about elements either being block or inline, right? Block elements such as headers H1, H2, H3, and paragraphs and divs, right? And the new semantic elements introduced in HTML5, such as articles and sections and all those, right? Those are all block elements, meaning they take up typically they'll take up the entire width of the browser, right, of the window, and add a vertical break, page break, right? And whatever content you introduce in these block elements, it just adds to the vertical spacing. Make sense? Whereas inline elements, they just flow from left to right, and from top to bottom, right? So they flow from left to right, and when there's not enough space horizontally, they just wrap and they continue to flow like regular text. That's what it does, right? It just flows from left to right. When there's not enough space, it just wraps, right? So elements such as input field, form elements, right? Form elements, images, regular texts, right? Those are all inline, or span, links, anchors, right? All these are elements just flow from left to right and from top to bottom, and they wrap. Make sense? Right? Now, oftentimes, we want to create content that has this layout that is something like this, right? Where we want to lay out the content such that you have maybe a content at the top for a header, maybe at the bottom you have like a footer, and the main content might be split up into 2 or 3 columns. Maybe on the left-hand side you might have a sidebar that allow you to navigate within the page. Maybe on the right-hand side you might have some additional aside information that is not as important. And then in the center you might have the main content. Make sense? So to do this, there is no default or native support for laying out something like this, right? You can accomplish this kind of layout with tables, right? Early on, when we first started using HTML, people started using tables for this. They would create 3 rows. These are 3 rows, right? 3 rows of which, and then where the first row you have one long row, you have 3 columns in the center row, and then you have again 1 long row. Typically, you can implement this with a table of 3 rows and 3 columns, right? Where you column span the first one, you span the columns 3. You span 3, right? Also, at the bottom, you would say column span equals 3, and you would span across all these columns. Now, This is considered to be a bad practice, right? To use tables for layout purposes, right? So I do not want to see you using tables for laying out your content. Okay? Don't use tables to lay out the content. So what do? What can we do instead? So instead, what we're going to be using is the floats. We're going to be using floats. Right? So floats allow you to take elements that are normally displayed as blocks, right, and be able to push them either to all the way to the left or all the way to the right, okay, and remove them from the from the normal flow of the content, right? So, for instance, what we can do instead is to, for instance, take the first one is just a regular div, right? So this one is easy. The first one at the top, that's just a regular div, right? And the bottom one also is a regular div. We could do that, or maybe a header and a footer. We could do that, right? But the other ones, these could be, this could be a main content, and this could be an aside, and this could be like a nav over here. This might be the main content, and then this could be an aside, right? But if we use that, those are displayed using block, right? They're displayed as block, right? So we need to override that somehow, and we can accomplish this by styling them using floats. So let's see how we could do this. Right? So here's one way that we could accomplish this. Right? So I'm going to grab this. Also, this is sometimes referred to as what is called a border layout. Right? So meaning you're laying out your content in like this border. Right? You have this like north border and the south border, the left border, the right, the east and the west borders, right? And then you have like the center, right? So let me copy this content. Right? Let me just copy this content. Let me go back here. I'm going to create a new page here. I'm going to say add HTML page. I'm going to say 001, and this is going to be border layout. I'll just call it border. Actually, not border because it looks like we're doing borders, right? It's a border layout. Okay, in here, let me close this. And I'm going to put here border layout. And I'm going to put this, there it is, the content. Ooh, this includes the body. I'm going to paste that. There it is. All right, so let me run this. And this is what we have so far, right? We have header, navigation, main content, aside, and footer. And they're implemented using, right, the top one is a header, makes sense, right? The bottom one is a footer. Here's the navigation on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we're going to have an aside, right? This is like secondary content. And then you have the main content in the middle. Make sense? Right? But right now, notice that they're all displayed from top to bottom. I'm also going to include the link. I'm going to include link, rel, style sheet, and href, CSS, and then style. So that's why we created a dedicated style sheet, right? So that we can share it amongst many pages, right? So I'm going to refresh. Notice that I removed the body, heading and padding, margins and padding. All right. So what can we do? So what we could do is add some styling in here and say that the West, right? All right, let's go to the style here. What we could do is say that that West over here, this West over here. I'm going to say it's an ID, right? It's an ID. So we can say hash West, float left. What this is saying is that, hey, wherever I am, I happen to be already in the left, right? It's already there. Navigation west, right? This west over here, which is the navigation, is already on the left-hand side, isn't it? But by saying float float left, it says, take me out of the regular flow, right? Instead of taking up the entire width of the page, right? Let everybody else, just flow around me. Flow around me. So notice what happens here. If I refresh, notice what happens to the main content. You see that? Right. Main content. What's happening is that the main content is now flowing around. Right. It's flowing around the navigation. Right? The navigation has been pushed to the left-hand side. Right. And anything that is next to it is going to flow around it. Okay. No longer is it taking up the entire width of the page. Right. It's only taking the amount of width that is imposed by the content. Right. If I make the content a little bigger, right, navigation. If I make this navigation, I notice that I make it bigger, right? It makes the width gets bigger, right? Now the width is imposed by the content, the inner content. Let's see what else. So we're gonna do the same thing for center, right? We're gonna do the same thing for center. I can say that this rule applies not only to west, it also applies to center. Right, so it's going to be pushed to the left, and anything else is going to flow around it. Right? So if I refresh, notice that now the aside is also on my left. That makes sense? All right. But what happens to the header and the footer? Right, what happens to the header and the footer? Well, typically we want to also give them a particular width and height. Well, I'm sorry, at least a width. Right? Notice that currently they're taking up the entire width of the page. Yes, and that might be okay. That might be okay. But for this example, I'm going to change that a little bit. I'm going to say that the north and the south, I'm going to give them a width. I'm going to have it, something fairly small, 100 pixels. Still 100. Did I save it? I don't know. Let me change the background color to make sure that it's being applied. Background color. I'm going to say beige. Okay, there it is. So it is working, right? So it is changing it to 100. Notice that before we had this, right? Oops. Before we had this, right? The default. Actually, what I want to do is comment out the width. Notice that the default behavior is to take up the entire width of the page. That's the default behavior. Okay, but we want it. We want this to be, usually what the design would be that we choose a particular width of the page, right? If you go to CNN or Wikipedia, usually what happens is that they have the content is of a particular width, right? And typically is centered in the browser. We'll do that in a second, right? But typically is of a particular width, right? So let's start with some width. Like a width, I don't know, is 800 too big for my browser? Yeah, it's too big. Notice the scroll bar at the bottom, right? Yeah, it's too big. Yeah, 100%. Do you see that? 100%. You see that, right? Okay. So let's leave it at 100, or maybe let's go down to 600 so that I can zoom in. Okay, there it is. And the navigation, what these might want to be is to also take up the 600, right? So let's do the navigation 100 and the aside 100, right? And then the middle one, whatever's left over, right? Which would be 400, right? So let's do that, and we'll do the we'll do west and also the east, right? East, both of them are going to be with 100 pixels. And the center is going to be with whatever's left over, right? So 600 minus 100 minus 100, that's 400, right? So it's 400 pixels. Oops. What happened here? Did I add correctly? 100 plus 100 is 200 plus 400 is 600, no? That should be enough. There's some padding that it's letting me... let me change the color so we can see these things. So let me change the color of the west and the east. West and east, I'll change the background color. Background color, I'll do this light blue. There they are. So they are 100. And what about main content then? Background color, light green. This 400. I'm sorry? Oh, east doesn't have a float. Thank you. Yes, right. So we're going to float the east, right? Also, thank you. Right, but you'll see what I'm going to float that. There it is. Thank you. Yep. There we go. But I wanted to point out something before we do this. So it looks like we're done, right? Looks like we're done. But one thing that we need to consider is that, yeah, I skipped over this. Let's force north and south to be 100. Let's force that just for 1 second, right? There they are. They're smaller, right? They're tiny. And let's force main content to be small too. Just because I just want to show you something. So here's center. We're going to say put it to 100 for a second. Okay. I was going to expect the footer to come up here. For some reason it didn't. Why didn't the footer? East, both west, center, and east. West, center, nevertheless, I am going to force, just in case, I don't know why it's not doing it now, to make sure that these floats, right? Usually what would happen is that anything else would start, being right next to this as well, right? It would just flow around it. And you want to make sure that you want to stop the floating behavior after a while. It says, no, okay, all these things are floating, right? Everything else, I don't want it to float. I want to stop the floating behavior. Otherwise, everything starts, just piling up on that other side. And the way you do that is to what's called you clear. It says, stop the floating behavior. In this case, we're using just floating left, right? And you can just clear left, right? But if there were any other floating left, floating right, the typical thing is to just clear everything. Just stop any floating behaviors that you might have had, right? Right now, and I want to go back to being rendered as a block, right? Or whatever I used to be, right? Just if I was a block, then I want to be a block again and take up the default behavior. I don't want anything flowing around me anymore. Okay. All right. Let's put this back to 600, and the center also back to 400. There they are. Okay. The other thing we might want to do is to center this, right? Typically, we want this to be centered. So let's do that. And the way we're going to do this is by wrapping this whole content with a div with a class container. And we're going to say, hey, this is a wrapper that we're putting around the entire content, right? So that we can style the way the entire thing looks like, right? So in the container, I can say, in the style, I can say, a dot container, right? We can say margin. We're going to give it a width. What was it? 600? 600 pixels. And margin auto. There it is. So it's centered now, right? Notice if I make it a little smaller and I get out of full screen, right, and I start resizing this, notice that it's always centered, right? If I make it smaller and big and small, it's always centered, right? Which is it's a typical layout of any website out there. That makes sense? All right. Okay. All right. All right. All right. So how did we achieve this layout? We achieved it using floating, right? Floating left, floating right. Now it might be that within the main, right, we might also have various articles, or might have various sections, right? Or that we also want to float left and right, and we want to have several columns, perhaps, embedded inside our main content. That's very common, right? Now we would now have to do the same thing, right? We would have to have some kind of container. We have to give it the width. We have to float everything inside and reinvent this technique and reapply this technique. Yes, right? But like good programmers that we are, we don't like to do things more than once, right? We like to create frameworks, right? We like to create abstractions or functionality that allows us to do this without thinking about it, right? Here we had to put a lot of thought into this, right? I got to float this. I got to make the width of this, right? I got to make too many decisions, right? It would have been cool if you let me do it using a table, but we already said that we can't use tables. Yes, we shouldn't use tables. But the really cool thing about the table is that it allows me to think about it in a grid, right? It allows to make me think about it in rows and columns. Yes, and how many columns am I spanning, right, throughout a row? That was very convenient, right? So what if we could think about this floating, right, and creating these layouts like a table, right, but not actually using tables, right? So we're going to use a technique called a grid system, right, that is very popular amongst several CSS frameworks out there, including Foundation and Bootstrap. And we'll look at Bootstrap next week, and we'll show you how Bootstrap does it. But I'd like to show you, what's behind the scene, how you come up with this idea, and then once you know what's behind the scenes and how it's done, then we can let you use the framework on your own. Make sense? It's like learning the multiplication tables, and then once you know how to multiply, we give you the calculator. Right? But I'd like to show you what's happening behind the scenes. So the way grid systems work is that they let me see if this works. Let me see this. Let's see if I can record myself. Let's see if this works. I'm experimenting here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and there I am. Okay, so you can see my platform. Right, so what grid systems do is that they break up the page into what looks very much like a table. So they break up the page into 12 equal parts. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's 3. 1, 2, 3 equal sections, like that, right? And what they do is they say, okay, this is going to be my smallest possible element that I can break it up into columns. So I could break it up into 12 columns, right? I can put content in here, and there would be very small, tiny columns, right? Or I can break it up into 6 columns, right? So we have one. This is one column of. There's another column. There's another column. There's another column, right? Or I can break it up into 4 columns, right? I can break it up into 4 columns. So I can break it up into 3 columns, right? Equal columns, or like that, right? Or I can break it up into maybe half and half, right? So here's 50%, and here's 50%, right? So notice that they're all built on top of the smallest common denominator, right? The smallest of this, right? And then everything else is just how do you say several orders of magnitude of this, right? So it's twice or 3 times or whatnot, right? So is it 1 or 2 or 3 of these, right? Or I can make combinations, right? I can have a big column here that spans across 6 columns, and then I can have 1, 2, and 3. Right? I can combine them. So this grid system allows me to break up the page into various sections, right? Why 12? It's 12 because 12 is a nice number that it's very easy to divide amongst across. I can divide it by 1. I can divide it by 2s. I can divide it by 3, 4. I can divide it by 6. Right? It's a nice number that is divisible by many other integers, right? So it gives me a lot of choices on how is it that I can lay this out. Make sense, right? So how do you build this? So let's go back to sharing my screen. So how do you build this? So let's see how you build this. And once I have the grid system, the border layout that we did by hand is trivial, right? You just a grid system, a border layout, it's just what? It's this grid system, but where you have one row that spans across 12 columns, right? You have another row here where you have the first column that might spans across maybe 2, 3. I might decide what I want, right? Then I have one that spans, so this might span across just 2, right? This maybe spans across 2, right? And this spans across whatever's left over. So 12 minus 4, 5, 6, this is 8, right? And this one spans across 12. Spans across 12 columns. Make sense? Right. So I don't have to think about this. Oh, I got to float. I got to do this, that. So let's see how would we implement a grid system. So let's create a brand new page here, and let's add the HTML page. So here's going to be 002 grid HTML. Okay, I'm going to say grid. And so what I'd like to be able to do is something like this. I'd like to be able to say, I want a div that is this is a row, right? Just like I would if this were a table. This is what I would do, right? I would have a tr, right? And then inside of that tr, I would have many columns, td, 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 right? So same thing here. That's what I'm going to do. I might have many columns. Class. This is a column, right? But if this were a TD, right, in a real table, I would need to say, well, this is a column, and I would need to say, well, does it span across many columns? Yes, right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to combine those two things into one single class. We're going to say this is class 1, meaning this is a column that spans across one column. Right, so this is the smallest column, right? The smallest column. And how many would I have? I would have 12, right? If I want to have each one be individual. So this would be column 1. This might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And this would be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Yes? All right. So right now, if I run this, or if I go to grid, where's the border layout? Was it grid? It's called grid, right? This is 2-grid. There it is. Right now, it's just plain old divs, right? So let's style this. Let's style this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, in the style, we're going to say dot row is a style for dot row, right? And we're going to say the dot column, column 1. Okay. Well, what do you guess column 1 is? Column 1 is, it's just that it's just going to float left. These are all going to float left, right? So I'm going to say float left, right? That, oh, that didn't work. Column 1, did I save? Why is it not working? Column 1, oh, I didn't link it. I didn't link, right? The grid. You know, scary would have been if it would have actually worked, huh? So this is link, rel is style sheet, and this is href is CSS, and then style. There we go. There it is. So it's it, right? So typically the grid systems also establish a particular size of what the grid system is going to be in numbers of pixels. You know, how much width is going to be. Let's use the current size that we were using. I think we were using 600 pixels, right? So let's say that that the row itself is going to be of a width of 600 pixels, right? And that the columns, if it's a column 1, then how big should the column be? It would be 600 divided by 12, right? Oops, sorry, no. Calculator. So it's 12. No, what is it? 600 divided by 12. Oh crap. 600 divided by 12. 50. Okay. Looks better. So column 1 is going to say width is 50 pixels. Right. So now if I refresh my page, now it goes across nicely, right? Plus, we might want to center that. So let me go to grid. And let me put this inside of the container. So I'm going to say div class container. Visual Studio has a very, very nice IDE, you know, that is aware of all these other dependencies, and it has a very, very nice type ahead. Right, and nice reformatting of the page. It understands what your page looks like and the layout. It's very, very nice. So anyway, if I refresh, notice it's centered now. What about column 2? Column 2 might look something like this, right? Where you have column 2 might be -2, meaning this is a column that's going to span across 2 columns, right? That means that it's also going to be float left, and the width is going to be twice as big, right? So it's going to be 100 pixels. So this would look like if I try to do this, I would have another row. Here's another row, right? Which is class row, right? And I would have div class column -2, and this would be column 1 column, and I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, right? Right. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There it is. So notice how they're nicely, you know, just one after another. I don't have to remember to clear. I don't have to remember to do anything, right? Soon, creating that border layout, it'll be trivial, right? I just want so many of these, right? Let's keep going. If I want to have another row with, again, with several of these columns. Column 3 meaning it's going to span across 3 columns, right? So this is column. How many of those will be? There will be 4, right? 4. There they are. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is column -3. Again, float left. I'm kind of getting tired of having to type float left over and over and over, right? Again, computer scientists are very lazy. We don't like typing things over and over. So what we might want to do is do a common, take that as a common denominator, right? A common factor, and have everything that is common to all these, right? Everything that is common to all these, just put it here, right? So that if we have anything that we should want to say about all these guys, right? We put it here. Dot column 6. Dot column 7. Dot column 8. Dot column 9. Dot column 10, and dot column 11, and dot column 12. They are all float left, right? Right, so that we don't have to do this. We don't have to do that. We don't have to say it over and over. The only thing we're saying specifically about each one of them is the sizes. Those are the that's the only thing that's different across these, right? So this would be with what would it be? 150, right? 150 pixels. So let's see if we refresh that. There they are, right? Column 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Let's do a couple more. Div. And this is exactly what you can do with Bootstrap. So next week when we start looking at Bootstrap and we start using the grid system, this is, oh, I know how Bootstrap does that, right? Obviously, Bootstrap is much more powerful, right? In that not only does it declare it for the desktop, right, but it has different versions, right? It has one for the phone, for tablets, right? For different, as you start changing the size of your browser, right, it applies different style sheets, right? It says, "Ooh, I need to go lower, right? Smaller and smaller and smaller," and then it flips everything to be horizontal, vertical, right? It just removes all the floats, right? Because floating when you're at a phone, right, it makes no sense. You want everything to render vertically as opposed to horizontally. So anyway, so Bootstrap is even more powerful, but that will become apparent when we look at responsive design on Friday, right? We'll look at how that's done, and then we put both together, and then it'll be obvious what's happening behind the scenes behind Bootstrap. Make sense? Okay, so let's do a couple more. So this is div class column. You see the pattern, right? The column. So there's 3 of these. So this is 1, 2, and 3. Oops. What do we do? Column class column 4. Oh, we didn't do column 4. I hate computers. They're always right. So this is 200 pixels, right? There they are. Let's do a couple more. Let's we have div class equal row. So let's copy this. There's several of these, right? Several rows, and then here we'll have a div that is class column 5, right? And with 5, let's see, what do we do with 5? We can't have 2 5. Well, actually, we can have 2 5s, right? Followed by a 2, perhaps. Yes, maybe a 2 or 2 1s, right? As long as it adds up to the 12, right? All the columns. So here we're going to have a 2 or 2 1s, a 2 or 2 1s, right? So we're going to have here column 1, column 2, and column 3. Again. So this would be what? Column 5, it will be 250. Okay. Notice that we chose 600, right? Which is nicely divisible by 12 and nicely increments by 50, right? If you would have chosen, say, 800, right, then the increments would have been something else, right? A nice increment that CSS designers use very often is 960, right? It's close to 1024, right? But they lower it down so that it doesn't take up the entire 1024 width, which is a very common size of monitor size, right? But they always want to have some padding in the, or some margins so that it's centered, right? So you want some white spacing in there, right? So 1024 is your entire window, and then some margins on either side, right? And then your document. And the closest thing that is divisible by 12, that is closest to 1024, but you still have some margins, is 960. And 960 is a nice number that is still divisible by 12, and it gives you all these increments that are whole numbers, right? That you don't have any weird divisions, right? Right. So column 5. How about column 6? Column 6 is what? Column 6 is 300, right? Column 7 is 350, right? This column 8 is 400, and column 9 is 450. Column 10 is 500. Column 11. It would be nice if this could be programmatic. You have like a for loop, and it generates all these things and it calculates that. Actually, we can do that. There's a somewhat of a newer technology called LESS or SAS, right? That is programmatic CSS, right? You can code. You can have variables. You can have loops. You can have all sorts of things. You can have nested CSS, right? And then you can calculate things, right? This would be a variable that is calculated over a loop, things like that. But you need a compiler, right? You need a compiler which would compile your executable CSS, right? And it generates a CSS, right? And then you would use the resulting CSS as part of what you link into. So now this style.css is the output of a compile process, right? So designers no longer, typically designers no longer code directly in CSS. They code in SAS or LESS, right? And you can go and visit them if you're interested. SAS with superpower. It's CSS with superpowers, right? So you can create. It generates the CSS for you, right? Anyway, very, very cool. Anyway, so let's do one more column. Again, we're developers. Developers are lazy, and which is good, right? And we create tools, right, to automate things for us. Right? We don't want to code this. We don't want to have to write this. Right? Again, if you're a developer, when you see a pattern, right, immediately you should think, oh, wait a minute, there should be an algorithm for this. Right? That's very time-consuming what you just did, right? Couldn't we have a for loop for this, right, or a function? Can't we abstract this, right? That should be your first reaction, and indeed there is SAS or less. Anyway, so now we're done. We can go back and create these things. Let's do one more here, and we can say here's class, and this is column 6, right? So here's column 1, and presumably there's another column 6, which is of the same size. Presumably these are 50-50, right? They're the same size side by side. There they are, column 1 and column 2. Here's column 1 and column 2 side by side. Finally, we have a div class. Oh, we already have rows. This is 7. Here's 7. And what do we do for the other one? We already have column 5, right? 5 plus 7, 7 plus 5 is 12. So we have column this for 5. Or it could be 3 and 2 or 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, whatever, right? You can combine them any which way you want. These now become Legos, right? Like little pieces that you can combine and do whatever you want. Let's see, you have now 8. This is now 8, and that can combine nicely with 4. right? And 2. Oop. And then we have this is might be 9, right? And then this would be what, 3? 3 with 2. This might be 10. 10 combines nicely with 2, right? And we have one more. Oops. This is 11, which combines nicely with 1. And then finally, we have 12 that it doesn't combine with anybody. Right? It just takes up the entire thing. Right? And let's remove these extra rows. Refresh. Now we have all the combinations whatsoever, all of them, right? So now creating the border layout that we spent time doing, we no longer have to spend time thinking about it, right? Because now we have an abstraction, we have a framework to think about this, right? We can think about it in terms of a table, even though we're not using a table, right? So to create that border layout, it's just what? It's just 3 rows, isn't it? So we have the first row, class row. That's the header, right? And the footer at the bottom, right? So this is a footer. Oh wait, sorry, we don't have content yet. We don't have content. Sorry. So the last one is just what? It's a row that has one single column that spans across 12 columns, right? So we have div class column 12, right? This is a footer. Same thing for the header. Oops. Right? So this is a header. Right? And then we have here the center one is one row that has 3 columns, right? So this would be what we have. Let me just copy this. We have 3 columns, right? One of them might be of size 2. The ones on either side might be of size 2. So that's 2 and 2. That's 4. So you left over with 8. So the one in the middle is 8, right? So this might be our center or main. This might be my navigation, right? Navigation, right? And then on the right-hand side, it might be my aside. There they are, right? Very quickly, we're able to reconstruct the border layout, right? Which is a very common way of laying out a page, right? Using this framework, right? Now, this framework is not it's not responsive, right? It's not responsive. Notice that if right, if I start making it small, notice that I have a vertical bar at the end, right, at the bottom, so it doesn't respond, right? So tomorrow or Friday we'll talk about how to make this responsive. And for instance, what it might do is that all these 3 might lose the float, right, and then become all vertical, right? So that you can scroll through them with your finger and whatnot. So we'll do that. Again, I don't want to see horizontal scroll bars, right, on any of your projects, experiments, or homepage. Yes? Unless you have a very compelling reason, right? And on Friday, we'll talk about how to make sure that you do not have one of these, right? All right, thank you.